Welcome back to BHY Solutions. Today we're going deep, into some really fascinating thoughts that you've shared on environmental architecture and sustainability and the whole relationship between, you know, the built world and the natural world.
hmm
It's a really complex area, and we're going to try to unpack some of the key ideas, maybe connect some surprising dots, and hopefully give you a clearer picture of this whole landscape.
Okay, sounds good.
And we'll be looking at historical viewpoints, modern challenges, potential future directions, all that good stuff. So get ready to have your assumptions maybe challenged a little bit, and hopefully experience a few aha moments along the way.
All right, I'm ready.
I know I am.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, one thing that really struck me going through your sources is how, even some of the most basic terms we use in this field, like nature itself, are actually more complicated than they seem. It's not just about, what's physically out there.
No, it's not. And that's a great starting point because you're right. Nature is slippery. It's not just about the raw material or the physical reality, but it operates on two levels simultaneously. So on the one hand, we have the material reality, the actual physical world, the ecosystems, the biosphere, what we're all a part of. But then on the other hand, nature is also a cultural construct.
Mm.
It's our understanding of nature, what we value about it, how we interpret it. And that's all deeply influenced by, our culture, our history, even our individual experiences.
Right.
So when an architect says, I'm designing with nature in mind, their inspiration for that can come from very different places depending on their concept of what nature is.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not just the tangible elements, it's our perception of them. And then, of course, we have these other terms floating around like green architecture and sustainable architecture. Sometimes they seem almost interchangeable, but your sources suggest they have their own sort of separate and interesting histories.
They do. The term green architecture actually has roots way back in the environmental movements of the 1960s. The counterculture of the 60s. Think about the rise of green political parties,
Oh.
the whole back to nature sentiment of that era. And when green first started appearing in architectural discussions, it carried some of that kind of countercultural baggage with it, almost like a questioning of mainstream approaches to building and design.
Okay.
But as the idea of, sustainable development gained traction, we're talking, like the late 1980s, green architecture increasingly became aligned with that broader goal of sustainability. And maybe it lost some of that initial critical edge that it had.
Okay, so sustainable became the more encompassing term.
Precisely. Sustainability has the potential to encompass this wider spectrum of viewpoints. It can refer to, established institutions trying to address environmental problems within existing frameworks, but it can also embody a more radical critique of our current ways of living and building.
Nice.
It can be adopted by both those who seek reform within the system and those who advocate for more fundamental changes, even revolutionary changes.
Okay, interesting. So we have this sort of layered understanding of nature itself. We have these evolving terms like green and sustainable. Now let's get into how nature has actually been used like as a source of ideas in architectural thought.
Okay.
It seems like throughout history, architects have consistently looked to nature not just for inspiration, but also to somehow justify or legitimize their designs.
This is a really crucial point. And I think if we kind of connect this to like a larger human tendency, we see this recurring desire to find validation for our actions or our ideas in the natural world. Take, for instance, the primitive hut theory. Even though there's really no like concrete archaeological evidence to support it, this idea that, classical architecture somehow originated from like very basic natural shelters was incredibly influential. It's as if to say, look, these perfect forms of classical architecture, they're not arbitrary. They actually evolved organically from nature itself.
Almost like saying, see, nature did it first, so it must be right.
Right. And it's not just limited to classical architecture. Sir James Hall, for instance, he was trying to understand Gothic architecture, and he actually conducted experiments using poles and flexible rods to kind of mimic the structural forms of Gothic cathedrals, suggesting that they were just as quote-unquote natural as classical designs, only drawing inspiration from, a different kind of natural environment, the intergrowth of trees in a woodland, for example. He was trying to give Gothic architecture the same kind of natural pedigree that classical architecture had claimed.
So this persistent effort to ground these very different architectural styles in some kind of natural precedent.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And then, of course, we move into the concept of organic architecture.
Hmm.
The very name suggests this deep connection to the natural world.
Right. But what's interesting about the organic analogy in architecture is that it often operates more on a metaphorical level
Y-
rather than just literal imitation.
Yep.
Think about the classical orders, the Doric column, seen as embodying the strength of the male figure, the Ionic column representing the more graceful female form, as Vitruvius described it.
Right.
These are metaphorical links between the human body and architectural elements. Even in the 20th century, Le Corbusier's modular system, which is really this attempt to harmonize human proportions with architectural dimensions, was based on a similar kind of analogy, drawing a direct line between the human body and the built environment.
So it's about finding a resonance, a connection between the human form and the spaces we create. But then the connection to nature gets even more direct and literal with someone like Santiago Calatrava, right? I mean,
Yeah.
his structures often have a striking resemblance to natural forms.
Absolutely. Calatrava's work takes that analogy to a much more literal level. The structural systems of his buildings not only function in ways that are reminiscent of, animal skeletons providing support and movement, but they also visually resemble those forms.
Right.
He famously keeps a dog skeleton in his studio as a kind of reference point for his structural thinking.
Wow.
And, while he acknowledges the influence of earlier architects like Felix Candela and Antoni Gaudí, the overt kind of figurative aspect of his designs is clearly demonstrating um, a deep engagement with how statics and movement operate in the natural world and how those principles can then be translated into architectural form.
It's like he's not just taking inspiration from nature, but he's almost performing a direct translation from the biological to the built. That's amazing. Now, your sources also discuss this significant shift in how we understand nature itself, moving away from this idea of a stable, balanced system towards something much more dynamic and complex.
Right.
How has that shift in scientific understanding influenced architectural thinking?
Yeah, this is where things get really compelling. Traditional architectural approaches, much like classical physics, often sought out these models of balance and stability, linear order in nature.
Okay.
But a new science, very much influenced by the work of Ilya Prigogine and Isabel Stingers, it emphasizes concepts like irreversibility and constant change, the inherent complexity within natural systems. Their work showed us that far from always striving for equilibrium, nature actually operates in states of disequilibrium where new structures and order can spontaneously emerge from seemingly chaotic conditions. Think about a snowflake forming. Complex order arising from these simple elements in a non-equilibrium state. And this understanding is profoundly influencing a new generation of architects.
So instead of aiming for this kind of static perfection, unchanging forms, they're embracing dynamism and the idea of continuous adaptation.
Precisely, yeah. They're increasingly interested in expressing concepts like relativity and inherent instability in their designs, moving beyond purely static and monumental forms. The work of John Fraser is a great example. He's exploring how to imitate nature not just visually but on an operational level. His focus is on the dynamic self-organizing processes that we see in natural phenomena, from the workings of the brain to weather patterns, rather than simply mimicking surface appearances.
Okay.
His concept of engineered genetics, for example, explores how complex architectural forms might be generated through processes analogous to natural growth and adaptation, which is a far cry from traditional top-down design approaches.
That's really interesting, moving from just copying the look of nature to trying to emulate its underlying processes. Now, this relationship between nature and culture is obviously a central thread running through all of this. Your sources suggest that, while human culture has always interacted with the environment, the power of modern technology has really amplified that interaction to a whole new level.
Yeah, and that's crucial. Some argue that human culture, from its very beginnings, has involved a degree of environmental, manipulation, even exploitation.
Hmm.
But the unprecedented power of modern technology has just dramatically increased our capacity to transform the environment, both intentionally and unintentionally. The text introduces this idea of a protegorian techne, contrasting it with a more purely instrumental approach to technology.
Okay. Unpack that a bit for me. What's the key difference there?
A purely instrumental, sometimes called Socratic techne, focuses primarily on efficiency and achieving, predefined practical goals. It treats technology largely as a neutral tool, a means to an end. often with less consideration for the broader ethical or environmental consequences. Protagoras, on the other hand, advocated for a technique that's more qualitative, pluralistic in its aims, where the process itself has inherent value.
Okay.
Think about craftsmanship, where the skill and care involved in making something are as important as the final product. This bona fide technique, as Nussbaum describes it, may be less immediately or directly effective in terms of, manipulating the physical environment.
Okay.
But it could be argued that it's more ethically and environmentally responsible in the long run because it considers a wider range of values and potential impacts.
Interesting. So less about simply getting the job done as quickly and efficiently as possible, and more about considering the wider implications and the inherent value of the methods we use.
Yeah.
And speaking of different fundamental perspectives, the text also introduces this interesting dichotomy between Arcadia and Utopia, and how these kind of idealized visions of paradise influence architectural thinking.
Yeah, this is a really useful lens for understanding different underlying motivations in architecture. Arcadians tend to look back to a past idealized state of nature, a nature benign without reservation. Their vision of paradise is often rural, simple, evoking a sense of nostalgia for this kind of lost harmony with nature. Utopians, on the other hand, look forward to a future paradise, which is often highly urbanized, technologically advanced, and seen as a form of salvation achieved through human ingenuity and progress.
So one finds its ideal in a natural past, the other in a sort of manufactured future.
Exactly. And this fundamental difference in perspective shapes how architects approach the built environment. Arcadian-leaning architects might prioritize natural materials, designs that blend seamlessly with the existing landscape, a sense of humility in the face of nature. Utopian-leaning architects, on the other hand, might embrace futuristic materials, bold new forms, and see technology as the key to, creating a better, perhaps even environmentally controlled future. It's interesting that the environmental movement itself contains elements of both of these viewpoints.
Right.
Some yearn for a simpler pre-industrial way of life, while others believe that advanced technology is our best hope for solving environmental problem.
It's a constant tug of war between the desire to reconnect with a perceived natural harmony and the urge to build a better future through human innovation.
Exactly.
Now, the rise of the machine age brought about its own powerful set of architectural visions and anxieties, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The advent of industrialization and machine technology sparked incredible optimism, but also some really unsettling dystopian visions in architecture. The Italian futurists, for example, they were completely enamored with the machine age. They called for this aggressive rejection of historical styles and the embrace of new materials, concrete, iron, glass, seeing the gigantic machine as this ultimate model for a new architecture. Their vision was one of constant renewal, almost a purging of the past in favor of a technologically driven future, where nature was seen as primarily as a resource to be harnessed.
That sounds quite radical, almost a complete dismissal of the natural in favor of the purely mechanical.
Right.
But there was definitely a darker, more cautionary side to that vision as well, wasn't there?
Indeed. Films like Fritz Lang's Metropolis presented a starkly contrasting dystopian view of the machine age, depicting this, dehumanizing urban landscape where the vast majority of people were essentially enslaved by the very machines that were supposed to liberate them, highlighting a significant social and psychological cost to unchecked technological progress. So while the futurists saw, liberation in technology, Metropolis warned of the potential for a profound loss of individual autonomy, identity, even fundamental humanity. It's interesting to note that these early critiques often focused more on the social and psychological impacts of the machine age, with large-scale environmental concerns becoming, more central to the discourse a bit later.
Right, right. So environmentalism in architecture can be seen as this more recent critical development, almost like a necessary course correction within the broader project of modernism itself.
That's a really insightful way to frame it. Yeah, environmental architecture can be understood as modernism coming to terms with its own potential for ecological exploitation. The environmental movement often uses scientific arguments and data to challenge what it sees as, an uncritical embrace of technological progress and the associated risks to the natural environment. So in this sense, it proposes itself as, a vital evolution of modernism, a potential future for how we shape our material culture in a way that's more conscious of its impact on the planet.
It's like modernism realizing it needs to mature
Yeah.
and become more responsible in its relationship with the natural world. Now, your sources outline some really specific principles for a new kind of architecture that really learns from the inherent complexity of nature.
Great.
What are some of those key ideas?
These principles offer a really fascinating framework for rethinking, our approach to design. One key idea is to maximize the fringes. And this concept, which is drawn from studies of complex adaptive systems, suggests that diversity and heterogeneity are actually crucial for resilience and innovation. The edges, the less standardized elements, they can be breeding grounds for new solutions. In architectural terms, this might mean, designing buildings with systems that can respond locally and continuously to their specific environmental conditions,
Okay.
rather than relying on a uniform, centralized approach. Think of a building skin with varied responses to sunlight and temperature across its surface.
Oh,
So embracing diversity and even a bit of unpredictable interaction can actually lead to greater overall stability and adaptability. Precisely. Another important principle is to have multiple goals. Unlike, simple machines that are designed for a single function, complex adaptive systems in nature often serve multiple, sometimes even seemingly conflicting purposes. Applying this to architecture means, conceiving of buildings not as static, isolated objects with a single function, but as dynamic systems that can adapt to a variety of needs and interact with their environment in multiple ways.
okay. So more like a living organism that constantly adjusts to its surroundings and serves various functions within its ecosystem.
Yeah.
And then the final principle you highlighted was to seek persistent disequilibrium. That sounds almost paradoxical.
It does at first glance, but the,
Yeah.
the underlying idea here is that a state of perfect equilibrium can actually lead to stagnation and a lack of adaptability in a dynamic system. But pure chaos isn't the answer either.
Right.
Persistent disequilibrium refers to a continuous state of being on the edge of change, constantly adapting and reacting to internal and external pressures.
Right.
And this really challenges the traditional architectural ideal of buildings as these fixed, unchanging monuments. And it suggests embracing the inevitability, even the benefits of dynamic change over time.
Interesting. These principles really do offer a fundamentally different way of thinking about architecture, moving beyond simple efficiency and control towards something much more nuanced
Yeah.
and interconnected and resilient. Now, the ethical dimension of environmental design seems incredibly important here.
Yeah.
Your sources touch on this idea of a universal obligation to protect the natural world.
Yeah. Environmental ethics puts forward this argument that we have a fundamental obligation to protect the Earth's life-sustaining systems. And the core reasoning there is that our shared existence within the natural world, transcends our cultural differences. We all depend on a healthy biosphere for our survival and well-being, and therefore we share a universal responsibility to care for it.
Yeah.
And this perspective leads to, the concept of environmental rights, the idea that nature itself, or at least the fundamental conditions necessary for life, have a right to protection.
That's a powerful, potentially transformative idea, extending the concept of rights beyond the human realm to the environment itself. But as the text also points out, actually persuading individuals and corporations to act ethically toward the environment remains a really significant challenge.
That's true. Human motivations are incredibly diverse, ranging from, genuine altruism and a deep sense of connection to the natural world to more self-interested concerns about, long-term resource availability or even just the potential for positive public relations.
Right.
The history of ethical thought has really been about gradually expanding this circle of moral consideration to include a wider and wider range of of others. And the argument of environmental ethics is that nature itself, the biosphere as a whole, should now be included within that circle, deserving of our consideration and respect, not just for its instrumental value to us, but for its inherent worth.
So shifting our perspective to really see the inherent value in nature, not just its usefulness to us, could be a key step in fostering more ethical and sustainable environmental practices.
Yeah.
Now let's turn our attention to the more tangible aspects, the physical materials we use to construct our buildings. The discussion around materiality and authenticity seems to have quite a few different facets.
It does. It does. There's a long-standing and often quite passionate debate about the concept of truth to materials. Thinkers like John Ruskin, for example, strongly advocated for a visible and honest connection to nature in building materials. A kind of integrity where materials are not disguised or misrepresented. He often viewed synthetic or heavily processed materials as somehow obscuring that natural connection and therefore as architecturally illegitimate.
So a strong preference for raw, unadulterated materials that clearly show their natural origins.
To a significant degree, yes. But others, like Gottfried Semper, had a somewhat different perspective. He prioritized cultural expression and the underlying type or organizing principle of building over the specific materials used. He argued that fundamental architectural elements like the enclosure or the hearth could be expressed in a variety of materials without losing their essential character. In fact, he even suggested that concealing structural elements and emphasizing surface treatments, particularly those inspired by textiles, was a fundamental aspect of architecture.
That's a very different viewpoint, focusing more on the cultural meaning and the underlying architectural idea rather than the inherent qualities of the material itself.
Right.
And then we have figures like Eugene Viollet-le-Duc, who approached the idea of truthfulness in architecture from yet another angle, particularly in response to the emergence of new industrial materials like iron and glass.
Exactly. Viollet-le-Duc advocated for a truth according to the program, meaning that the building should clearly express its function,
Okay.
and a truth according to the methods of construction, meaning that materials should be used in a way that respects their inherent properties and capabilities. He argued for acknowledging the fundamental differences between these new industrial materials and traditional natural ones, and for developing new architectural forms that honestly express the unique structural and aesthetic qualities of iron and glass, rather than just trying to, mimic traditional forms.
So it wasn't necessarily about returning to quote-unquote natural materials, but about an honest and rational engagement with whatever materials were being used,
Right.
whether natural or industrial. And this brings us directly to the critical environmental implications of our material choices, particularly this concept of embodied energy.
Yeah, this is an absolutely crucial consideration for sustainable architecture. Embodied energy refers to the total amount of energy that's consumed in the entire life cycle of a building material, from its initial extraction from the earth through its manufacturing, transportation to the construction site, and even its eventual disposal or recycling. Life cycle analysis is a really valuable tool for comprehensively assessing these environmental impacts. As your sources highlight, materials like sustainably harvested wood, for example, generally have significantly lower embodied energy compared to energy-intensive materials like steel and aluminum, which require a lot of energy to produce. So choosing to build extensively with materials like steel and glass dramatically increases that initial energy footprint of a building.
So even if a building operates with high energy efficiency once it's completed,
Yeah.
that initial energy cost of creating its constituent materials can be huge, almost like starting with a significant environmental debt.
Right.
And the concept of payback, the length of time it takes for a building's operational energy savings to offset that initial embodied energy becomes really important here.
Precisely. And current building performance standards often primarily focus on operational energy consumption, how much energy the building uses for heating, cooling, lighting, et cetera, and don't always fully account for that significant embodied energy.
Right.
So the idea of setting limits on the acceptable payback period, for example, could provide a strong incentive for architects and developers to prioritize emphasizes the use of materials with lower embodied energy. It also raises some important questions about whether the promise of future clean energy production in these highly technological ecotech buildings truly justifies the potentially high levels of fossil fuel energy that are used in their initial construction.
It's a complex equation with a lot of, interconnected factors that need to be carefully weighed.
Hmm.
Now, environmental architecture also seems to strive for a more deeply integrated and mutually beneficial relationship between buildings and their natural surroundings. That this idea of symbiosis.
Yes, the ultimate goal is to move beyond simply minimizing the negative impacts of our buildings and toward the truly symbiotic relationship where the built and natural environments actively support and enhance each other.
Why?
And this involves a holistic approach that includes utilizing renewable energy sources, prioritizing recycled or low embodied energy materials, and thoughtfully integrating passive environmental design techniques, which often draw inspiration from, traditional vernacular architecture,
Right.
things like natural ventilation, daylighting, thermal mass. The aim is to really, blur those artificial boundaries between the man-made and the natural, creating buildings that function more like integral parts of the local ecosystem.
Hmm. So buildings that not only take resources from their environment, but also contribute positively, or at least integrate so seamlessly that the distinction becomes less clear. And speaking of traditional architecture and its relationship to place, your sources also discuss the ongoing importance of culture and regional identity in architectural design.
This is really vital. While mainstream modernism often aspired to this kind of universal architectural language, there's been this growing recognition of the enduring value of local vernacular traditions and the importance of responding sensitively to specific climatic and cultural contexts.
Okay.
The concept of critical regionalism is an architectural approach that specifically attempts to negotiate this tension, seeking to integrate the progressive and universalizing aspects of modernism with the unique character and traditions of a particular place. Think about architects like Alvar Aalto in Finland or Luis Bergon in Mexico, who incorporated local materials, building typologies, and cultural sensibilities into their distinctly modern designs.
So it's about finding a way to be both contemporary and deeply rooted in a specific cultural and environmental context, rather than, imposing a generic one-size-fits-all architectural solution.
Yeah.
The pervasive influence of Western technology and globalized culture inevitably poses a significant challenge to preserving these distinct regional architectural identities, doesn't it?
It certainly does. There's this, constant tension between the understandable desire to embrace modernity and its associated, benefits.
Uh-huh.
And the very real risk of cultural homogenization and the erosion of unique local building traditions. Figures like the Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi, he passionately advocated for a deep return to traditional building methods and locally sourced materials, emphasizing both their expressive qualities and their suitability to the local climate and economy. However, in many parts of the developing world, associating traditional architecture solely with the pre-modern era can be problematic if the pre-modern is perceived as inherently inferior.
Right.
So hybrid approaches that thoughtfully blend appropriate Western technologies with valuable indigenous knowledge and traditions may offer a more viable path forward in many cases.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act, respecting and building upon, rich cultural heritage while also embracing progress and addressing the practical needs of contemporary life in a sustainable way. Now, shifting our focus to an even larger scale, how do these ideas of, environmentalism and complexity and interconnectedness apply to the urban environment and the future of our cities?
This is where the implications become truly far-reaching. There's a growing interest in applying the models and principles we see in non-linear natural systems
Mm-hmm.
to the scale of the city itself. Viewing the urban environment as a complex, self-organizing system.
Yeah.
And current thinking often involves a spectrum of ideas from those who advocate for more inherently sustainable urban forms.
Okay.
Compact, walkable, mixed-use, decentralized models, to those who see the increasing influence of information technology and cyberspace as potentially reshaping or even supplanting traditional physical urban spaces.
So the fundamental question becomes, can the principles of environmental design and our evolving understanding of complex systems
Right.
help us to shape more sustainable, resilient, and ultimately more livable cities for the future?
Exactly. The concept of industrial ecology, for example, offers a compelling model for transforming the linear, resource-intensive industrial processes that characterize many cities into more circular, closed-loop systems. Mimicking the resource efficiency of natural ecosystems, economic incentives, supportive government policies, and changes in consumer behavior are all seen as crucial levers for encouraging this kind of sustainable urban development. There's also, ongoing discussion and research into the optimal balance between centralized and decentralized urban forms in terms of, sustainability and resilience, as well as the profound impact that, information and communication technologies are having on how we live, work, and interact within urban environments.
It sounds like the future of the city is increasingly being viewed through this similar lens of interconnectedness, dynamic interaction, and the blurring of traditional boundaries that we've been discussing in relation to individual buildings and their sites. And that the traditional binary between the built environment and the natural world seems to be breaking down at the urban scale as well.
Yeah, and ideas of fusion and the concept of the field are really challenging that long-standing separation. Instead of rigidly defining buildings as discrete objects standing apart from the landscape, this perspective encourages us to see them as emerging from and being deeply interconnected with a continuous environmental and social field. This allows for more flexible and inclusive approaches to urban planning and design, moving beyond simplistic, either scenarios like city versus country, and opening up possibilities for rethinking urban density, the integration of green spaces, and the very nature of urban life itself.
Okay, let's unpack what all of this means for you, the listener. This deep dive has really shown us that environmental architecture is so much more than just adding a few green features to a building.
Hmm.
It represents a fundamental reevaluation of our relationship with the natural world, drawing insights.